So very happy to kick us off with a brief introduction, and then we'll dive right into the data. So if you can move us to the next page, Kathrin, exactly. My name is Anja. I'm an associate partner from McKinsey based in Munich. I've been with McKinsey for almost 10 years now. I co-lead our work on micromobility, but in general, I work with lots of mobility disruptors in the micromobility space, but also electric and autonomous driving space, trying to think through how to scale and hyperscale new businesses in the context of urban mobility. Kathrin.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Kathrin Kiefer. I'm an expert in the McKinsey Center for Future Mobility as well, based in Stuttgart in Germany and part of McKinsey since 2020. I'm solely serving clients in the mobility ecosystem, and the majority of my work is focused on two-wheelers and micromobility there. And I'm mainly working at the intersection of the market sizing, market outlook, and the consumer perspective.
Thank you very much, Kathrin. And last but not least, Darius. I'm an expert also in our Center for Future Mobility. Together with Anja, I'm co-leading our micromobility perspective, specifically focusing on market forecasts and also the consumer survey insights. I'm very happy to be here. It's, as you can probably imagine, not our first time to hold this webinar. So we are very excited to again show you around our newest insights. And today, for the very first time, not only focus on market size estimations, but go even deeper into our consumer survey insights, which, to give you a bit of a context, are for us the fundamental pillar, so to say, of why we are so optimistic about the micro market, and of course also for our market size estimations. So we are very happy to be here. Before we deep dive into the content, let me quickly hand over to Anja, who will quickly lead us through how the MCFM works. And then we are very happy to start with our presentation and the content.
Super. And I mean, I'm sure most of the audience, they've heard of us, Center for Future Mobility. That's essentially our think tank within McKinsey, where we have a dedicated group of experts around the globe who think about nothing but sort of the future of shared mobility, micromobility, autonomous driving, and so much more. We are a team that basically works around the globe. And as you can see on the page, I mean, we do many engagements per year with a fair high share of sort of work with micromobility disruptors, sort of working with smaller companies who are going through the early growth stages. But we also work in the adjacencies. So companies who sort of big incumbents who want to get into that space, but also adjacencies like insurance, leasing, financing, and so on. And every year we publish lots of insightful reports, hopefully. One of them is obviously our work on e-bikes. So we look forward to diving deep on this in today's session.
And with this, I'm very happy to continue. And of course, to maybe set a bit the context about what we are talking today. We want to give you a very brief outline of how we see the market for bicycles and specifically electric bicycles today and in the future. But then, of course, we'll spend the majority of the time talking about our latest insights from our Bicycle Consumer Survey. This is a brand new survey that we conducted in February 2024, so just a couple of months old. And then, of course, we want to end up by showing you how we can work with you, how we can also support you in scaling your business. Let us, that being said, switch to our market size outlook to a bit give you a brief outline on where we see the market as of today. What you can see here is how we estimate the value pools for micromobility for both private and shared micro across bicycles, kick scooters, and mopeds today, and also by 2035. We estimate the market to be roughly 160 billion USD large, so quite a sizable market size already. But what is probably most striking and more interesting is to see how big the share of traditional and electric bicycles is already today. You can see this in the blue chart. We estimate, when we talk about value pools, that the market share of bicycles is already at 80% as of today. And of course, will also be very big if you look at the market numbers until 2035. We expect the global micro market to more than triple to roughly 520 billion USD. And thereof, again, the bicycle market will remain with a share of probably 70 to 80%. Now, when we, of course, ask why this is, one fundamental reason for this is, of course, the consumer, right? And that's basically also the framing and the reason why we are so bold about the market. If you turn to the next page, what we then did is we took a deeper look at the bicycle segment specifically. And what you can see here is a focus on the key regions, Europe, China, and the US, again for 2022 and for 2035. What you can see is that on the one hand side, Europe is the leading bicycle market as of today. Out of these 100 billion USD in value pools, Europe roughly makes up 60 billion, followed by China and the US. But maybe besides the pure top-line market sizes, what I personally find very interesting is the e-bike penetration, which you can basically see as the light-colored brackets of these bar charts. So the shaded parts of the bar charts show the value pools for traditional bicycles, and the colorful bar charts, if I may say, are making or showing us the electric bicycles. And as you can see, we already estimate the market for electric bicycles in Europe today to account for roughly 40% of the entire bicycle market in Europe. In China, this share is much, much bigger, whilst in the US, the share for e-bikes is naturally still lower. But what you can also see, if we turn out to the right-hand side of the bar chart, is that these shares are expected to change significantly in the future. On the one hand side, we believe that the e-bike penetration will even more increase in Europe, of course, fostered on the one hand side by the consumer, but on the other hand side by purchase subsidies, by tax incentives that we have seen all around the continent. In China, we roughly estimate the e-bike penetration to stay constant, whilst in the US also increase substantially to roughly 50%, but of course starting from a lower baseline. So overall, you can see that yes, we are very bold about the bicycle market overall, but this is particularly true for the e-bicycle market. And one of the main reasons for that is then, of course, the consumer itself. That being said, let us switch now to our newest insights from the Consumer Pulse. And I want to give you a very brief outline on what we actually did here. So we asked more than 2,500 current users, but also persons who are considering to use bicycles in the future, trying to understand how their purchasing behavior, the usage behavior, but also their social demographics look like. We did this survey across 5 markets, including Germany, France, Netherlands, the US, and China, and therefore try to cover basically all key regions that are out of interest and that typically constitute the largest bicycle markets. We asked more than 85 very detailed questions. You can see an outline of these questions on the right-hand side, trying to understand, as I said, their social demographic profiles, which includes the age, which includes the residential area, which includes the income group. And then on the other hand side, ask also very detailed questions about what are their key buying criteria, how much are they willing to pay for certain bicycle types, up to which sales channels do people typically use when they are purchasing specific bicycles. Now let me turn to the next page and start with a very, so to say, high-level question that we always ask consumers across the years. What you can see here is how consumers evaluate their preferred micromobility mode, looking at the broad portfolio of micromobility modes. And you can see, and that's something which is, to be honest, the biggest constant, so to say, across these 6 years of market sizing, the bicycle is always the most preferred micromobility mode. You can see that roughly 35% of consumers say that they prefer the traditional bicycle, so the manually driven bicycle, 34% of consumers the e-bicycle, and then you have a constant change of modes following that. Depending on the year you look at, sometimes people prefer the moped, sometimes people prefer the e-kick scooter. So that's something which is constantly changing. What I also find interesting is when you ask those people who are preferring the bicycle about their preferred bicycle type, we can see that the majority of users prefers city bicycles or trekking bicycles as their preferred bike type, which of course is an indication of the fact that users start using bicycles for a broad portfolio of use cases, right? It's not anymore a niche use case. People use it for errands, people use it for leisure use case, but then of course also for sports. Another question that we typically ask is, we try to understand how do people expect to change their usage of specific modes of transport amongst those people who are already using specific modes today. So what you can see here in that chart is we estimate and we ask consumers about their preferred mode of transport and their their typical usership behavior. We can see that roughly 24% of the respondents that we asked use a certain form of bicycle more than once per week. And then we asked exactly those share of people how they plan to change their future mode usage in the future. And it turned out that the bicycle is the mode where we can expect the highest increase of mode usage amongst the current users today. Quite striking and not surprising, probably. When you look at the private car, also not surprising, here we see the lowest net change. And then we also ask consumers about their top drivers, which makes them to use the bicycle even more. And not surprisingly, better bicycle lanes turn out to be the biggest driver. Secondly, the notion of safety is becoming more and more relevant. 50% of our respondents say that safer roads and intersections would make them ride their bicycles more often. And then followed by more convenient parking, which I would typically summarize as parking and charging possibilities. Let me, that being said, now turn to Kathrin, who is our consumer survey expert and is now, so to say, assisting us and presenting even more interesting insights, starting now with the bicycle ownership.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Darius. So when we now look at the ownership of a bicycle and how this differs across different regions, we can see multiple things. So firstly, we see that the typical bicycle design, which you can see here as illustrations, differs by region. So whereas in US and Europe, we mostly have the typical city/trekking bicycle design, bicycles in China and especially an e-bicycle is often looking much different there. So the typical trademarks that we see are smaller tires, a lower saddle, a higher steering wheel. So bicycle like this you would most commonly see in China, but is rather rare to see in Europe or the US. Then secondly, when we look at the ownership rate, we see that Europe has the highest bicycle incidence among the focus countries when it comes to the combination of personal and household ownership. So Europeans and US bicycle owners on average own 1.3 bicycles personally, whereas owners in China tend to only have one bicycle. And thereby we see that the multi-ownership for bicycle is mainly driven by the need for different bicycles for different use cases. So a consumer would typically have an e-bicycle maybe for longer distances and for commuting, and at the same time maybe a gravel bicycle for weekend trips and for exercising. When it comes to the purchase price, Europeans are spending the most across the regional comparison. So we see that the average price point here is around 1,850 euros, followed by the US with roughly 1,600 euros, whereas in China, bicycle prices are 2 to 3 times lower than that. And this is especially coming from the bicycles that are locally produced and also having a much lower price point, roughly around 600 euros. And this is then also further reflected in the top brands that we can see for the different regions. So in Europe and the US, brands tend to be rather international. So we here see top brands like Drag, like Giant, Gazelle, you name them. Whereas in China, we see that really the local producers like Yadea and Aima are leading the way, where also this lower price point comes from. So when we now ask consumers how they use their bicycles, we can see a difference for electric and for traditional ones. Both are almost equally used for typical everyday trips, but where we see a difference is that the e-bicycle is more often used for trips that might have been more typical for a car, I would say. So such as doing grocery shopping or bringing and picking up kids. And on the other side, the traditional bicycle without the battery support is increasingly used for exercising in comparison. And when it comes to the usage pattern that we can see at the right-hand side, we see that the e-bicycle is used more frequently, firstly, so with around 1.8 trips per day instead of 1.5 trips. And this combines, by the way, the trips for commuting, errands, and also for leisure. And then secondly, we see that e-bicycle trips are with 4.8 kilometers, around 20% longer versus the traditional ones. And this, I think, is a very similar pattern to what we can see also from popular bike sharing systems around the world, like we have in New York City or also in Paris, where consumers use e-bicycles more frequently and also for longer distances. And the main reasons for the consumers to cycle are firstly exercising for roughly half of the consumers, and then also the sustainability aspect and also the financial attractiveness of cycling compared to other modes. So now deep diving into the commuting part of the usage that I just showed, we can see that also the commuting patterns differ across regions. So the e-bike is more used as a commuting vehicle than the traditional one in general, particularly in Europe and the US. And interestingly, the US consumers have the highest number of commuting trips with their e-bicycles. But on the other side, we see that the total commuting distance with both the traditional and also the electric bicycle is highest in Europe. So a typical bicycle commuter, so to say, in Europe would roughly travel 3,000 kilometers to work and back per year with his or her vehicle. And when we look at how many consumers use their bicycle for commuting at all, we see that Chinese and European bicycle owners have the highest commuting rates. And especially in China, the e-bicycle is a very typical commuting mode for almost half of the owners there. Going now over to the ownership. So when it comes to how consumers own their bicycle, we see that the outright purchase is definitely by far still the most spread ownership type. So we here ask consumers how they purchased their last bicycle. And especially in China, there is a very small rate of roughly 1% of the people that used alternative financing options. In Europe and in the US, around 15% of consumers used leasing options, private or corporate leasing, financing schemes, or subscriptions to purchase their bicycle. And this is not on the slide, but when we, by the way, look into how this would change for people that are now considering to buy a new bicycle in the future, we see that the preference for alternative ownership models is even slightly higher than that as for the last purchase, so showing a slight upward trend for these new ownership models. Going over to the next one and going over from ownership and usage to the purchase of a bicycle, we can see that the main purchase criteria also is different by region. Top criteria in US and in Europe is the purchase price. So 45% of US consumers and 65% of European consumers state the purchase price as top decision criteria, whereas in China, the design is most important for 40% of the consumers. And as we could see earlier, the bicycle prices are much lower in China, also in relation to the income, by the way. So this might be one of the main drivers why the price is less relevant over there. Other important factors that we see from consumers are the battery size to achieve a reasonable range, the driving performance of a bicycle, and then also the functionality of it. As I said, the price is the top decision criteria for 65% of the consumers. In Europe, we're now kind of doing a deep dive into that topic. And we compared the average price for a bicycle in the last purchase versus the planned willingness to pay for the next bicycle purchase of bicycle considerers. And what we can see is that across all segments, considerers are willing to pay 9% on average more as compared to their last bicycle, so to say. So the budget is around 2,000 euros for the next bicycle purchase. And the main reasons for that increase are surely an increasing adoption of more expensive e-bicycles that we now see, and also an overall increasing prices for bicycles in the market. And looking at e-bicycles in particular, so not across traditional and e-bicycles combined, we can see that the current bicycle owners in Europe spend roughly 2,150 euros for the last one, whereby the budget is roughly 200 euros higher than that. In comparison, by the way, for the sample within the European countries, so Netherlands, Germany, and France, we, by the way, see that the French consumers have the lowest willingness to pay across the Europeans. Also tied to the purchase price are, of course, the discounts received with the purchase. So one type of discounts is, of course, a subsidy that a consumer can receive. And I think we have currently around 300 subsidy schemes that are active in Europe, and I think roughly 100 in the US, so a large number of subsidy schemes that are available. And we ask consumers if they received a governmental incentive for the last purchase. And as we also currently see in the market, the demand for those programs in some regions is quite high. So I think I read for this or last week that in Minnesota, the e-bike program that came back online got more than 10,000 applications in less than 20 minutes. So really a huge demand also for that kind of incentives. So when we ask consumers about that, we can see that 30% of US consumers and 20% of European consumers used an incentive to buy their last bicycle. In both regions, the average sum that was received by subsidy receivers was around 500 to 550 euros, whereby the smaller subsidies up to 100 euros or US dollar in that case are in comparison more common in the US versus in Europe. When we now look into how and where consumers want to buy their bicycles, we see that there is a large preference for physical stores. So around 4 out of 5 consumers want to buy their bicycle offline. The main reason for such a strong preference for an in-store experience is the ability for a test ride for 55% of the consumers. And then also the fact that consumers can have a personal consultation there and also a better interaction with the retailer. The 60% of consumers that prefer an online purchase find it easier to compare different brands and their features side by side. And they also value the more convenient experience around the online purchase without also the pressure from any salesperson standing next to them. What we also can see on this slide is that no matter if online or offline, multi-brand stores where consumers can compare different brands side by side are really favored by the consumers over the exclusive single brand stores that only have one single brand to offer. So to complete now the topic around the whole bicycle process, a purchase process, we would lastly want to show you how considerers think about their current purchase timeline then. And we see that 4 out of 5 consumers are stating to be more likely to purchase an e-bicycle now compared to last year. So I personally find that a very high number, mainly because those consumers state they want to do more exercise now, they have improved financial circumstances to afford a bicycle now, and they also see better bicycle offers, also with better technology available in the market. For consumers that are now less likely to make a purchase decision, which is around 5%, so a rather small share, they report about deteriorated financial circumstances, like attractive prices, or to be still satisfied with their old bicycle, making a new one obsolete. So I now also would like to quickly deep dive into the topic of corporate bicycle leasing, especially in Europe and especially in Germany. We have experienced a boom in this with this concept in the last years. Probably most of you know it, but for those who don't, it's a concept that provides employees with an opportunity to lease a bicycle from their employer at a relatively low monthly rate due to tax advantages and salary conversion. And when we ask consumers about their sentiment towards that, we see that 85% state firstly not to have access to such an offer from the employer, but that more than half of them, thereof, so 55%, would actually consider using such an offer once their employer introduced it. And then on the other hand, we see that 50% of the consumers state to really already have access to such a corporate bicycle leasing offer by their employer, and that there's really a high interest rate in the market, with 65% thereof either stating to already use this offer or to considering to do so in the closer future. And for the consumers, the corporate bicycle leasing is mainly attractive as it provides them access to more expensive and higher quality bikes, which they would not afford otherwise. They value the aspect around the salary conversion and the tax advantages. And they also like the financial flexibility due to the monthly installments. So paying a smaller sum as a subscription, basically, instead of paying the large sum at once at a purchase. So last but not least, from our consumer bicycle polls, we asked consumers about their sentiment towards cargo bicycles. So probably the bicycle segment, which has experienced one of the highest growth rates in some parts of Europe in the past years, and which is also supported by a ton of available subsidies, by the way, for B2C and also B2B customers with really large subsidy support sums. And here we see that 50% of consumers could imagine to replace their car trips if they owned a cargo bicycle in the future. And if we ask consumers what they would use such a cargo bicycle for, we also see that those are the typical kind of trips that today are most commonly done with a car, so the shopping kind of trips, running errands, etc. So that having said, this was the last insight, so to say, from our Bicycle Consumer Pulse. I just want to mention, like Darius said in the beginning, it's only a handful of insights that we now presented, so we have much more on used bicycles, maintenance patterns, part sourcing, also a lot of brand perception, by the way, for different and top brands in those regions. And also on the consumer insight side, we are a dedicating team that really works at the intersection of only mobility topics and consumer work, and help clients with a broad spectrum of completely different questions. So we validate, for example, new products or features with clinic concepts. We benchmark products against competitors. We are deep into customer segmentation analytics. And of course, not doing that only from a market research perspective, but always kind of deriving strategical recommendations based on that. So we are really at the intersection of the different worlds. Yeah, so if that is becoming interesting for you at any point, feel free to reach out, of course. And having that said, I'm hand over to Anja again.
Super, thank you, Kathrin. And before we go into the Q&A section, we wanted to reflect a little bit of how we on the McKinsey side actually also use these insights for our day-to-day work with our clients. So on the next page are just a couple of examples. And I think we mentioned in the beginning that, of course, our clients range from the very big incumbents who think about going into new segments, exploring smaller form factors or so, but also a fair chunk of our work in the Center for Future Mobility is, of course, with mobility disruptors. Yeah? So that's smaller stage companies who might have who might just be thinking about an idea, sort of trying to validate a product, who might be a little more sort of further advanced in their growth stage, going through a series ABC, or even players who are actually thinking about, okay, what is my road to IPO in the next 1 or 2 years? So here are just a couple of examples of how we actually deploy these insights and help clients shape their growth aspirations. So the first one is just an example of a shared micromobility player where we were basically doing an end-to-end review of their strategy, thinking through how do we feel about the form factor, the design, is it appealing to customers, what's the timeline, go to market, in which countries, and so on. So if you're ever looking for an end-to-end review of what you're doing and wanting someone to challenge that, happy to do that. The next 2 ones are a little bit about go-to-market. I mean, in our experience, we are now in a stage where we have lots of exciting companies out there with sort of very appealing products who might be sort of either piloting a small fleet in a B2B setting, or who might be sort of selling their first batches of hundreds, 200s, 1,000 bikes in the market, but who really want to understand what's the next growth curve now in terms of commercial acceleration. And there, oftentimes, we take part of the data that Kathrin and Darius now presented to say, okay, are we really in the sweet spot in terms of pricing, in terms of design, branding, which channels should we use? Should we go through a dealer network? Should we go direct to customer? How does that translate back into the business case? So really thinking about your next S-curve of growth is, I think, a very interesting question that we are happy to think through with you. The fourth one actually as well. So we're doing this with different players. And then the last one, and this is usually where we start with our clients to say, okay, we have all these great insights from the Center of Future Mobility. We compare notes. You in the audience, you will also have your sort of your own view and your own market analysis. And we compare notes and shape that into a compelling investor story. And as I said, that could be the very early stage sort of angel round, but that could also be multi-million races where you really think through, okay, what is the USP, and investors challenge you hard on your market size. So we are happy to also team up there and think a little bit about sort of how you can be successful on the fundraising side. That being said, we're very aware that many of you are sort of in these early stage phases. So typically there's always creative ways that we can find to partner with you. Cash is never a constraint. So ping us one-on-one. We are happy to explain a little bit how we work in so-called performance-based arrangements. Yeah, so all of our arrangements are basically structured around a win-win situation where we as McKinsey only only benefit if you basically accelerate your business. Maybe a last thought on the next page. So hopefully some of the data that we presented today were interesting to your specific businesses and your sort of thoughts around growth. But as Kathrin said, of course, we have that in all sorts of different data cuts, segmentation ways. So what you can do if you sort of want to learn more, if you are very interested in how your product fits into this whole landscape of data, you can either ping us, of course, but we also have now a self-serve platform online where you basically log on and you can find different data cuts and even more detailed analyses of whatever it is that might be interesting to you and your business. So you see some of the themes on the right. Do that, but also ping us. I'm sure there's more and more specific insights we can share with you. Good. That being said, maybe we do a little bit of a Q&A session. Thank you for some of your questions in the chat already. And I don't know, Luke, if you want us to just go through the list, or if you want to throw us some questions, happy to do it either way.
Great presentation. I was just taking screenshots and really immersed in it. I thought that was really amazing. Hope everyone else was too. Yeah, we'd love to take some audience questions. I think, Darius, you guys wanted to go through and choose out some ones that you thought would be good to start with. So maybe I can start, or would you like to start? How would you like to go?
Happy to start. And I see we have 15 questions open. I already answered 3 offline to a bit reduce the queue. And I see many interesting questions. One I saw about the future market for microcars versus e-bikes. And that's, of course, touching a very good point, because at the moment, we only talk, so to say, about a very small segment of the small format mobility segment, right? When we look at the micro cars, or as we define it at the mini mobility segment, for us, it's also a segment which basically would fit in between the micro mobility market, so between kick scooters, bicycles, and mopeds, and the car market. And that makes us so bold also about that market. We believe it's a sweet spot market where you basically address the use cases that a car addresses. You can take your micro car to the next shopping center. You can carry on groceries. But on the other hand side, it also addresses the pain points that we see in the micro space. You have weather protection, you can carry goods. And therefore, for us at the moment, we estimate the micro car, or let me call it the mini mobility segment, which also would include tricycles, quadricycles, and also golf carts, as roughly double the size of the entire micro mobility market, as we can see today, right? So we are very, very bold of that, knowing, of course, that there might be certain substitution effects, especially when we talk about trip distances that start at 7-8 kilometers and end up at 10-11 kilometers. Another question, let me quickly take this one. If we compare the Southeast Asian market and the Chinese market, I think it really depends now at which mode of transport we look at, right? If we only look at the bicycle market, specifically the e-bike market, China is, of course, a very substantial, a very big market. For us, how we define properly noteworthy, the e-bike market in China is not only the, so to say, like European type of form factor, but we also include the seating bicycles when we talk about the Chinese e-bike market. So that market is, of course, very big, very substantial, and of course, the biggest market if you look at Asia. Now, on a value pool perspective, so if you sort of say leave behind the number of vehicles or leave behind also number of kilometers traveled, we also believe that South Asia is still bigger than the Chinese market. We have seen here a couple of interesting movements also in the premium segment, where we have seen prices increase for the South Asian market, leading, of course, and the value pools to be bigger.
And maybe also to add on that, Darius, I think if we also want to put this into perspective a little bit, what is the size of the Chinese markets? We see that already today 50 million e-bicycles sold per year. So really also compared to Europe, this is a completely different dimension, of course. I think we have in China roughly 300 million bicycles on the road in circulation, so electric bicycles. And when we go or look at India, for example, there is also a large number of bicycles sold annually, but what we see there is typically also a higher shift, or also historically anchored, that the larger two-wheelers, so basically everything starting from 50 cc or now in the electric world 4 kilowatt upwards, so that there for commuting, also for professional usage, then the two-wheelers, like we call them, which is different to the typical bicycle, is more popular.
Yeah, I can take, Ada, your question on last mile delivery. I think we do some specific work on last mile in particular as well, so happy to connect one-on-one. In general, I would say, it depends very much on the player. Yeah? So if you have a player like who is very much focused on post doing smaller things, we do see the e-bike, but more often actually it's the tricycle for these types of use cases. And then if you go into the parcel space, of course, that's more cargo bike type of form factor, where in my experience, the post and parcel players have very specific requirements on what the dimensions of the actual vehicle is in terms of cargo load, in terms of weight, in terms of ability to move around. So that becomes a very, very interesting sort of customization type of play. And we do see lots of strategic partnerships where actually the post and parcel players demand very specific form factors, and then also commit to volumes. I would say, of course, that segment is earlier stage. It's sort of still pilots going on. So, of course, the consumer segment is way bigger in general, and it's also scaling faster at this point. But for sure, last mile, also very sizable segment, but works very differently.
Maybe the next question, which I think is a short one, related directly to one of the slides, about what the sales prices include. So if it includes the taxes, so the prices that we ask about is the MSRP, so the typical retailer price the consumers bought their bicycle for. So yes, in that case.
Thank you, Kathrin. And I see also one question, whether we also looked into the design preferences of customers.
Yeah. So we definitely looked into different segments. So how consumers think about, for example, mountain bikes versus racing bikes, etc., and also how their segment choice changes in the future. In that survey in particular, we did not ask we did not make consumers compare different design examples, so to say, from different brands. But this is also something that we typically do, not only with entire bicycle designs, but also with single features.
And we do that in our, I mean, it's mostly car clinics so far, but sort of comparing your specific product to competitor products, and then we sort of have actual consumers look at that and give very detailed and very specific feedback. We can arrange such a forum.
Exactly. So we do it with clinics, like you just mentioned, but we also did it before in the two-wheeler space, for example. So design choices for two-wheelers, not only in live clinics, so to say, but also with surveys and qualitative interviews where we tested different design options for example, mopeds and motorcycles.
Then I see one question. Thank you, by the way, John. You have very good questions on whether cities should work towards converting car-based roads to multi-use roads. So, I mean, when we talk to consumers, but also the cities, I think it's a either-or answer, right? The notion of multi-use roads, typically from a safety perspective, does not get a lot of attention, because we have seen that as soon as cities start to, so to say, mix bicycle with car traffic, we have also seen accidents increasing. And therefore, we typically hear, especially from cities, that if they want to foster bicycle usage, then it is by separating really bicycle roads and car roads. We have seen a couple of examples where cities simply didn't have the space to do so. So then basically what happened is they forbid the overtaking, for instance, of cars. Cars would not be allowed anymore to overtake bicycles. And then, of course, they reduced also the entire speed of the whole traffic system. But I personally do not see a future where we should, so to say, mingle car and bicycle ridership. It has to be separated in order to increase safety levels.
And just to pile on, I think sort of introducing new e-bike lanes or bike lanes is oftentimes a quick fix these days. There are so many tenders out there in cities where they just roll out bike lanes. Our experience is cities who really do it right, they think about their entire sort of urban mobility concept, sort of mobility hubs. How does that even work? Going from the train to the bike, switching form factors, and doing that in a smart way. But I agree with you, Darius, in general. I think that mix is will not be the dominant logic moving forward.
Maybe I can take the next one on what role does security play for bicycles. So what we can see is, for example, when we ask consumers about adjacent services that they would like to add to their bicycles, that really the security features like GPS tracking, safety bundles, etc., are the top choices. So, for example, over predictive maintenance features, cycling accessoires, and so on. So security for the bicycles is really also on the top of the consumer's mind. And this is increasingly, of course, with the e-bicycles, which are coming at a higher price. So we typically also see that the out-of-pocket spend for e-bicycles or the willingness to pay also for adjacent services, insurance, etc., is much higher for e-bicycles than compared to traditional ones. So this safety aspect is becoming more and more relevant there.
Then I see a very interesting question about the regulation point of view. The question is, what is expected in terms of safety measures, speed limitations? Again, when we talk with cities, I think the whole notion of making bicycle ridership independent from car ridership, I think that is, so to say, the overarching theme, right? You can see this in big cities, in metropolises. You can see this also in medium-sized cities, because in the end, what a consumer typically prefers and needs in order to increase and to change also the mobility behavior is to feel safe, right? We've seen this in the bicycle market. We've seen this in the e-kick scooter market. The only way, so to say, where we have seen a bit of a mingling between different transport modes is within micromobility itself. So we have seen in the Netherlands, for instance, a couple of cities where they start to, so to say, mix moped usage with e-kick scooter usage with bicycle usage, and it works out well. But it only works out well because there is a very clear limitation in terms of speed. It works out well because many of these cities at least try to incentivize also helmet usership. But it only works because these micromobility lanes are separated from all other mobility lanes. And yes, we do believe that in the end, regulation will be, if you will, the enabler of this entire space. Even though consumers willing to use micromobility, there has to be the infrastructure in place in order to also enable it.
I can take the next one on the customer behavior towards second-hand bicycles. So what we see from a consumer perspective is that when we talk about bicycle considerers, roughly 10 to 20% of the considerers are looking into used bicycles as well. Interestingly, the willingness or the openness, so to say, to buy used is much higher when you look at parts only. So consumers are more open to, for example, buy remanufactured parts to replace something on their bicycle than buying a used bicycle completely. And what we see here as main concerns is still that consumers are afraid for the lack of quality. They have a little bit of trust still. And also there is a large question around what happens when with the warranty and so on in case of a repair. So there is still some uncertainty from a consumer side. From the driver side, we see that it's very much cost driven. So 80% of the consumers are considering a used bicycle for the cost. Of course, there's also some factor around the sustainability, but this is really the main driver. I personally think that there is still happening kind of a mind shift when it comes to the used bicycle market. So when we talk about used bicycles, probably many consumers still have in mind that they buy a used bicycle from a private person like 10 years back on Craigslist or eBay, etc. So this is where these pain points that I just mentioned come from. But of course, now we are like in a much more professionalized world where we have so many subscription players and so many corporate bicycle leasing players that have bicycles that are 1 or 2 or 3 years old only, and that get remanufactured, refurbished, and really get kind of a quality certification. So I think this is something that has to change a little bit in the perception of the consumers to get to this tipping point still. But we do see that the used bicycle market has been growing a lot in the past. We also see now that, for example, in France, there are new regulations kicking in where the subsidies also now cover used bicycles, for example. So if you buy them from a professional outlet, so I think those things are more and more coming to the market as well here. So we are very, I think, optimistic also for the future uptake of the second-hand bicycle market. The further down the road.
Then let me maybe take the next one. I saw one about the most potential for growth for e-bikes in the US. Now, the US, of course, is an interesting market because if you look at the market overall, of course, it's like a very big potential market, right? We have especially seen adoption for e-bikes in the B2B space. Especially when it comes to cargo e-bikes used for the transportation of parcels, also for food delivery. However, what we have also seen, and that's probably the biggest hindrance for the market, is that the infrastructure is not in place, right? We have seen many companies trying to implement an e-bike fleet, but have realized that actually the roads in the US is not built for the e-bike, right? And therefore, that is, in our perspective, the biggest concern, because in the end, as also Kathrin pointed out correctly, it's in the end a matter of TCO, right? But if you are sort of say restricted to bring your parcel from A to B because you cannot reach on time, then of course it's a hindrance. So we see the US market still a bit ambiguous. I think the underlying trends are there, especially when you look at the B2B segment, much more in fact than for B2C clients. But we often also have in the US the problem that infrastructure is not yet in place, especially when you look at bigger size cities. When you look at mid-sized cities, if I may call them, then of course infrastructure is there because car usership is not as high. But again, here we talk as compared to Europe about still a relatively small market yet. We have so many questions. Anja, Kathrin, anything interesting to you?
I mean, one question, Katalin, you were asking about the Netherlands. Yes, we do have sort of specific data cuts also there. So for any deep dives, probably connect one-on-one.
I can take the next one on ownership, and if we also see a similar dynamics for subscription versus ownership outside of Europe and Germany soon, especially in Asia. I think the large difference in the market is really the price point that we saw earlier. So if you can afford an e-bicycle, and this was the average price point, by the way, you can also get an e-bicycle in China and also in other Asian countries for 300-400 euros. So there, of course, a financing scheme or a leasing scheme doesn't make so much sense from a consumer perspective like it does in Europe for the higher priced bicycles. Maybe I could imagine there could be some niche, because now we also see that high performance bicycles in China, for example, are kind of getting a niche market as well. So these are then the kind of bicycles that are more imported, but it's a very, very small share of bicycles when you look at the overall bicycle population. So as I said, I think this is a concept that is probably more relevant in Europe and the US, typically or mostly because of the low price point in China and Asia.
John, I can take your question on servicing e-bikes, where we see any changes and how that's being done. To be honest, if you ask me, I don't see a sort of dominant design yet. I see players who proactively work on their design to actually avoid service or service and maintenance. They are removing chains and so on. That's one trend on the product side, I would say. This customer promise of, hey, this is actually sort of with a bike without service need. Then I see players partnering with the typical independent aftermarket repair shops, the big chains, so that you can actually, if you want to scale quickly, you can have a sort of good footprint coverage across the cities, and you go city by city. And I also do see, as you describe it, mobile service units or partnerships where actually startups offer to do the servicing on, and they follow their customers and do that in a very sort of low capex partnership type of manner. So I personally haven't seen the dominant logic for the future. I think we are still a little bit in this testing phase.
Yeah, agree. And also maybe to add here, I mean, what we see is now that also more and more people are shifting maybe from car trips to bicycle trips, or is also even shifting ownership completely. So these are maybe also the type of consumers that have experienced a different kind of repair and maintenance service in the past, and they might have this benchmark, so to say, from the car experience in their minds. So I think, as you said, we are also still in a phase where this whole topic around maintenance and repair is kind of professionalizing to also improve the customer experience there for the bicycles.
Excellent. I can't believe how many good questions came out of this conversation. I know there are so many we didn't get the chance to get to. I'm curious, maybe that's a good segue. What would be the best way for folks to get a hold of you all if they have more questions?
So you can always reach us via email, of course. I think, Kathrin, if it makes sense to use the last minute to quickly show our email addresses. Otherwise, you find us on LinkedIn. And I think the last solution is, of course, via you, Luke, and our friends at Micro Industries. Feel free to reach out to us. As we said, I mean, we can always only touch base on a very small part of the knowledge base that we have. We wanted to use this occasion to specifically deep dive now our consumer service. But we're gonna have some very exciting sessions also coming up, where we then take a more vehicle-focused look, try to understand the BOM of also the vehicles. We are currently in the process of analyzing really on a component basis the price structure. So all of these questions, so to say, are very welcome, and we're happy to answer them always.